I'll give you a thumbs up.
Deomu. We were making fun of it.
Are you ready, Scott?
Yes.
She's gonna speak soon.
She might open her mouth.
Go.
If the creators of the Bible had included moral thinkers, such as Plato, Socrates, and Cicero, how different would the world's history be? Philosophy professor and public intellectual A.C. Grayling has spent the past 30 years trying to answer this question. The result? A new compilation of over 1,000 texts, modeled after the Christian Bible, but which focuses on great philosophers from across the ages. A work Grayling cheekily titled, The Good Book. According to an April 4, 2011 BBC News article, by not referencing God, souls, or the afterlife, The Good Book offers a secular take on how to lead a good life. The Good Book has topped Amazon's book sales list and has been featured on numerous religious websites, news and television outlets such as CNN and The Colbert Report. As Stephen Colbert states, without a moral absolute truth, all bets are off. It's all just hookers and blow. Considering the Good Book's attempt to expand morality beyond the bounds of religion, we must ask the following research question. How does the Good Book use religious rhetoric to create alternative interpretations of morality? To answer this question, we can look to Roger Aiden's article, Redefining the Cradle of Liberty, the President's House Controversy in Independence National Park, found in the Journal of Rhetoric and Public Affairs of 2010. Through his article, Aiden draws on the cultural ideology of patriotic values to challenge the way the history of the original President's House is represented. This model fits our artifact well because Grayling's Good Book challenges the way religious texts represent the cultural ideology of moral truth. To analyze the Good Book using Aiden's model, you must first define its stages, then apply them to the Good Book, and finally, determine some critical implications. In his 2010 article, Aiden examines the controversy surrounding the commemoration of the original presidential house. According to the National Park Service website, nps.gov, before there was the White House, George Washington lived in the president's mansion with his family and 9 slaves. According to the UCLA Today of April 3, 2011, in 2002, historian Gary Nash started a grassroots campaign to recognize the roles of the slaves at this historic site. Those wishing to shed light on the president's mansion's questionable history engaged in 3 stages of counter-narrative discourse: application of the cultural ideology to the dominant narrative, application of the cultural ideology to the counter-narrative, and how a combination of these 2 narratives offers a more complex representation of the cultural ideology. In the first stage, the ideology is applied to the dominant narrative, which is the foundational story that represents the status quo. Aiden asserts that in this step, the ideology is turned back upon the dominant narrative so as to critique it through the cultural ideals it is supposed to represent. When integrating the history of the President's House and the oppression of the slaves, this depicts the disparity between the ideal and the reality of the nation at this point in history. In the second stage, the counter-narrative establishes a connection to the existing cultural ideology through structural elements such as language. For example, in the original President's House controversy, Aiden contends that the proponents of the campaign used the idea that the United States represents liberty and equality to illustrate the injustice the slaves endured by voicing the marginalized viewpoints. When combining the history of the President's House and the history of the slaves, the overall picture of the President's House becomes more complex, as the site becomes more than a patriotic symbol. It also serves as a reminder of our nation's prejudicial past. With an understanding of Aiden's rhetorical phases, we can now look at the rhetoric contained in the moral counter-narrative of Grayling's Good Book. In the first stage, the ideology of moral goodness is applied to the dominant narrative of equating morality with religiosity. Grayling argues that religious texts fail to offer complete truth and wisdom. In the Good Book's epistle to the reader, an introduction that frames the work, Grayling illustrates the limitations of religious texts through the analogy of a fisherman, writing, "It has been remarked that he who takes his nets into the stream might find something of advantage to himself there, but he who takes his nets into the ocean might expect greater catches and from greater depths." Grayling's rhetoric works to convince the reader that religious texts are incomplete and require a more complex definition of moral goodness. In the second stage, the counter-narrative establishes a connection to the existing cultural ideology of moral goodness. It does this by offering a more complex definition of moral goodness, as seeking understanding in truth and wisdom. The Good Book's Book of Wisdom, chapter 3, verse 8 argues that the desire for knowledge for its own sake, as well as for the sake of moral goodness, results in the greatest attainment of wisdom. The Good Book redefines moral goodness as an intellectual pursuit, rather than a religious concept. In the final stage, the Good Book combines these two narratives, but only partially fulfills Aiden's third stage, unlike the history of the President's House, which shows how these narratives work best together. Grayling's Good Book strips any religious narrative. A clear example of this is the book of Genesis. In the biblical story of Genesis, humans eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. But this fruit is identified as a sin and results in the fall of mankind and exile from communion with God. In the Good Book's Book of Genesis, it relates a similar account concerning man, fruit, and knowledge. But this story is the one of Sir Isaac Newton and his discovery of gravity. The Good Book's Book of Genesis, chapter 1 states, "In the garden stands a tree. Its fruit is knowledge, teaching the good gardener how to understand the world. It was from the fall of a fruit from such a tree, which new inspiration came for inquiry into the nature of things." Grayling's Good Book celebrates knowledge and fits his definition of moral goodness while arguing against the depiction of knowledge represented in the Bible. Through the Good Book, Grayling has compiled as well as written a work which offers morality to those who do not believe in a deity. Aiden's rhetorical stages reveal a discourse which attempts to redefine morality and to critique religious texts, which brings us back to our research question. How does the Good Book use religious rhetoric to create alternative interpretations of morality? Our answer is twofold. First, that the Good Book introduces new discourse on humanity, and second, it expands discourse on what is considered moral knowledge. Our first implication emerges from the emphasis placed on humanity provided by the Good Book. This is clearly exemplified through the Good Book's conclusion. It ends hopefully arguing that when humans strive for goodness in the world, that the true promise of humanity might be realized. Rather than relying on religious figures, or even the logic of great philosophers, the Good Book's key argument is that individuals can gain the skill of moral knowledge. Unlike those who use their interpretations of the Bible to explain why divisive issues such as homosexuality is immoral, Grayling never takes a stance on any such issue. Instead, the Good Book, Grayling creates an ethical framework so the people can decide based on their own moral compasses how they feel about these issues. In addition to arguing that humankind is intrinsically moral, Grayling expands the definition of what is considered moral knowledge. A constant refrain throughout the work is the relative nature of goodness. While religious texts argue certain actions, such as lying, cheating, and murder, are always sinful in nature, the Good Book argues actions should be evaluated based on their impact on individuals and humanity as a whole. Thus, Grayling expands the scope of what is considered moral knowledge. Today, we have examined Aiden's rhetorical phases, then applied them to the Good Book, and finally, determined some critical implications. By fulfilling his dream to create an alternate moral history, Grayling has created an alternate discussion of morality, which he hopes will welcome all voices. Near the end of the Good Book, Grayling offers this poignant reminder. In our human world, in the short time we have, we see our duty to make and find something good for ourselves in the human predicament.